Hi everyone, thanks Annie for arranging this and everyone for joining. Unfortunately, because of some technical issues, you'll just have my voice and my slides for now, but hopefully we can chat live afterwards. So I'm a PhD student at LCC based at CRiSAP, and I'm halfway through my doctoral research. I'm interested in the artefactualisation of voices through archives or through the processes of archiving. Particularly how listening practices to oral history and to recorded testimony affects the making of voices through processes of archiving. So my planned fieldwork for the PhD involves 3 archives connected to the 1947 partition of British India, which is my limit case for the PhD. But I will talk more about this at the end. My non-academic background is in radio journalism and a bit of music, and this has informed my artistic collaborations with Radio Apartment 22, which is associated with the independent Rabat art space of the same name. So Apartment 22 is run and curated by Abdullah Karim, who is a radiophile and also he's a director at the Mataf Museum in Qatar. So his project sort of is quite a nomadic one. And the first project that we worked on together in 2015 was the one that sort of really led me here. So 1,000 Channels began in 2015 as a series of radio episodes that traced the journey of the travelling public programme Ancestors. Ancestors was curated by Natasha Jinwala and travelled to 4 countries in South Asia across 6 months. The interdisciplinary events programme charted, quote, a layered timescale of planetary belonging amidst terrestrial, cosmological and decolonial terrains to read against the grain of the brief history of nation-state in the divided Indian subcontinent. So when Natasha approached me and asked if I was interested in producing something for ancestors and about ancestors, this reading against the grain for me became listening against the grain. So this attempt to orally attend to the South Asian region through conversations, oral histories, field recordings, storytelling, as well as performative work, film excerpts, internet rips and other sound elements. So 1,000 Channels tried to animate the processes of relocating ourselves in this partitioned region. So as I said, I could only go to one of the events, which occurred in Lahore in Pakistan. And this meant that I could actually take part in the programme. So the Artist Tentative Collective, I collaborated with them on their site-specific workshop called the Gandhi Engine Commission. So Gandhi means dirty, and it was a site-specific workshop that navigates through the Ravi River to explore themes of development and destruction, waste and toxicity. Drawing on the Persian meaning of the word Ravi as narrator, we activate the river as a site of storytelling, tapping into the memories and archives within its subsoil, excavating and reframing stories of multiple wreckages and ruinations from colonial histories to the neo-colonial present. So it was a very rich and I thought radio-friendly kind of workshop to be producing. And over those days, I ended up sort of recording all members of Tentative during like the rehearsals, the practice, their encounters with and responses to their encounters that were unexpected in the process of making this work, such as encounters with the police, encounters with local people who we've included in the audio as well. So you can have a listen to that at the State SoundCloud. And yeah, what else to say? Well, maybe I can play you a clip now.
Which basically means that waste and wasted lives are the inevitable debris of modernity. The video on the left is footage of the sea from Gadani, the shipwrecking beach. The translator. What does it say after?
So as well as being hosted online, the audio was also played at 2 sites at the Biennale public programme. On this slide you can see on the left was the full wall text for the little listening corner that we set up in the Zahur al-Akhlaq gallery at NCA. So because I didn't really know what to write about this, I decided to make an index or a kind of contents which was a very descriptive and straightforward explanation of what you could hear in the pieces that were looping. And in itself, it's quite a sort of weird but very intricate document, and the complexity of South Asia, I think, is quite revealed in it. It really felt like, because I've done a bit of DJing, that this was a bit like mixing in terms of overlaying or blending or chopping, and not really having a necessary compositional strategy, but perhaps committing more to like blends of horizontality, so not one voice or sound has apparent authority over another. And you can sort of dip in and out as and when. So in 2017, Natasha invited me to work with her on another project in the context of Contour Biennale in Mechelen, Belgium, which she was curating. The theme of the Biennale was Polyphonic Worlds, Justice as Medium, and she had asked me to come up with a sonic response as part of the public programme, similar to my involvement in Ancestors. So working with researcher and collaborator Francesca Savoldi, we decided to experiment with a temporary recording studio at the opening weekend. We called it Café Univers, after a cafe that we liked and saw in Tangier. And the studio would involve listening to the radio with participants of the Biennale in real time. We used the website Radio Garden, where you can navigate the world's radio stations a bit like Google Earth. And they are live FM and AM feeds, mainly mainstream radio stations. So Café Univers ended up then just being more about talking about art with artists. It became a place to dialogue freely around sound, place, and histories of struggle, places of exile, places where you didn't have signal, religious radio, and so on. The episodes navigate mainstream stations, as I said, via Radio Garden, and it ended up being sort of unscripted, a sonic exploration of South-South solidarity and the collapsing of physical-digital space, vis-a-vis these chaotic dynamics of listening to the radio while rotating the world. And people could also play their own music if they wished, so we had another sort of channel set up where people could play things off YouTube or anything else that they thought of or that they wanted to share.
From the beginning of making the first film, Caribbean, I'm really happy and like really excited making movies.
But a little bit nervous.
As well. Yeah, with a big camera and all that, seeing like really doing close-up shooting and all that, sort of made us really nervous and a bit shy as well. But as we were like shooting that film, we were just like normal and like everyday conversation was like talking to each other. Yeah, talking about our country and land and all that.
Drinking.
Yep.
Some of the artists that we sat down with included Tibetan filmmakers Ritu Sarin and Tenzing Sonam, Caribbean Film Collective from Australia's Northern Territories, and the Colombian artist Pedro Gomez Agana, as well as others. And these conversations didn't start with the question, where are you from, or what do you do? But more often than not, it started with, where do you want to go? So I will play.
Hay unas radios pequeñas en la región que son increíbles, una música fantástica.
La cosa curiosa, antes estamos navegando un poco el Caribe y encontramos muchas radio católicas, muchas radio cristianas.
Últimamente, en Colombia, en los muy pocos últimos años, ha habido un boom como evangelizante.
That's the Tibetan plateau there.
But in fact, we don't listen to any radio stations out of Tibet simply because they don't exist. I mean, government-controlled radio stations, if there are any. But in exile, where we live, which is this side of the mountains, somewhere here in Dharamsala, we have a couple of local radio stations as well as Radio Free Asia and the Voice of America and Voice of Tibet, three radio channels that broadcast in Tibetan.
So we can just take you to Dharamsala, why don't you?
Yeah, but Dharamsala would be somewhere up here, like somewhere around here. Yeah. Just on the foothills of these mountains.
There might be some station.
There will be some local...
But let's go and see what we can find there. Just maybe if you go from Pathankot to one side, that's going too far. We're not so far up here.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So we're like 4 hours drive from Jammu.
That looks like the closest to where we live.
Really? Jammu and
yeah.
Kashmir.
I mean, as far as the stations are concerned, yeah. It's about a 4-hour drive from Dharamsala.
My most recent collaboration with Radio 22 again was in the context of the exhibition Notre Monde Brûle, or Our World is Burning, which is currently on at Palais de Tokyo in Paris and has been postponed until after the summer. So this time Abdallah was also curating the exhibition and so invited us to represent the radio project and provide a sort of audio guide to the exhibition itself, but also produce pieces around the themes. So Our World is Burning offers a political view on contemporary creation from the Arabian Gulf, where war and diplomatic tensions have been determining the history of the early 21st century. So the title refers to human tragedies caused by the successive and ongoing conflicts in the region, but it also relates to recent ecological crisis and environmental disasters. Not only is fire a statement of danger, but it's also the symbol of a tremendous democratic impulse that this region of the world has been experiencing since the Arab Springs. So we, as I said, were sort of present as R22, so we interviewed the artists, as many as we could, during the 2 weeks before the exhibition opened, and we were living in an apartment in the museum, which was really amazing experience, and also experiencing the exhibition installed at such a scale, which also, but there's a lot of banging sounds in the background. So we also had a listening station set up in the exhibition where people could listen to the pieces, so we had to produce them quite quickly. As I said, it was meant, Notre Monde Brûle on the right is a sort of audio guide to the exhibition. But then we also decided to create our own content. So R22 is Burning was supposed to actually have more content on it, but because of the lockdown, we weren't able to do any more. So it became, again, this sort of collaborating with people at a distance. And so through cross-border and multilingual collaborations and a sort of obsession with historical detail, it takes fire as a sonorous theme across various moments and locations.
If we can turn and face the tower for a final 72-second silence. That silence begins now. Thank you.
So some of the things that we've produced or sort of commissioned on there is a recording of a silent walk that takes place every month by the Grenfell United, which is the supporting organisation for the victims of the Grenfell Tower fire. But we also have less sort of seriously political things like field recordings, like readings and compositions as well.
1, 2, 3 स्टार्ट। तुम संविधान में छेड़छाड़ करोगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम भेदभाव करोगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम मजहब के नाम पर बांटोगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम लाठियां चलाओगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम गोलियां बरसाओगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम जुल्म करोगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम CAA लाओगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम NRC लाओगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम NPR लाओगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम दंगे करवाओगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम हमें बिकाऊ बोलोगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम हमसे कागज मंगवाओगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम इंसानियत के नाम पर दरार बनाओगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। सॉरी, can you pause it? तुम सियासत के नाम पर दरार बनाओगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम इतने अच्छे दिन दिखाओगे, हम इनकलाब लाएंगे। तुम बेटी बेटी बोलकर सड़कों पर ले आओगे, हम शाही ईदगाह में आएंगे।
क्यों नागरिकता को देखते हो, क्या गरीबी कम नहीं देखने के लिए? क्यों परमाणु को देखते हो, क्या शहादतें कम नहीं देखने के लिए? अरे क्यों वापस नहीं लेते काले कानून को, क्या सड़कों पर भीड़ कम नहीं देखने के लिए?
Just a little bit about that clip. The artist Pallavi Paul, who I met in Belgium actually during Contour Biennale, I asked her to record what was happening at the time of the Delhi protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Registration of Citizens, which has created a lot of protest across the country because of its treatment of Muslims, but also the way that police brutality has escalated since the protest has meant a continuation, at least until the coronavirus, a continuation of feminist occupation in the cities. So what we heard were voices of women making up poems and songs during one of the protests, one of the protest camps. Which brings me to this, to the last project I would like to talk about, which is directly related to my PhD. So as I mentioned at the beginning, my research project has been very influenced by my experience in audio work, not only as a journalist, but in these artistic contexts as well. So frameworks of listening became an issue for me. How to record, represent, voice, edit complex encounters of politics, history and art, in one sense working as a chronicler, but in another develop a kind of practice of its own. So juxtaposition especially became a powerful tool for narrating, collaging together voices and recordings as a way of interrogating the order of time as well as our fixed notions of history. The medium of sound, I think, can liberate us from certain norms of legibility, to use Nikita Dhawan's terms, particularly in the case of archival voices.
How old were you?
I was about 6 years old.
6. You trust your memories?
Yes. And the other thing I remember, I can't never forget in my life that the person who sell bangles, very huge, we call him Palwan. So he was a bangle seller. Then we used to live on main GT road. If we stand in our gallery, then we can see the road below. One evening, there was a riot, and his throat was half cut. And he was just lying like this on a rickshaw.
So, as I also mentioned, oral history and testimony have been quite crucial to partition history, no less because official written colonial records are destroyed, hidden, or hard to access. An increase in oral history work, museums, exhibitions, and other outputs are part of a sprawling range of, to use Vazira Zaminder's term, partition effects. And the increase of these sort of partition effects, where the trauma of 1947 and the impact of it has been recognized publicly and sort of in museum settings and in educational settings, ironically has occurred in parallel to a sort of increasing silencing and widespread forgetting of this complex history, and also the complex colonial history that preceded partition as well. So for my research, partition is taken as a sonic environment more than a fixed historical event. And this is an idea I'm still working out and justifying. But I can perhaps quote anthropologist Veena Das, who puts it quite well. She says, partition as a life world produces its own set of languages, symbols, and silences. And I think for those who don't know a lot about partition, the sort of the subjugation of and sort of splitting and reordering of identities, I suppose, when new nation states are created after colonial rule, I think was particularly not only violent in the case of 1947, but it was also especially violent in terms of people's own subjectivities and who they felt they had to align, belong, be named as. So this naming is also a very interesting kind of idea for me, and my broader purpose is to explore this idea of partition as a sonic environment.
A fable. Universalism and partition were neighbors, though never good friends. Universalism would go about its business without bothering to itemize personal interactions or economic bills. A woman was not assumed to be a woman because she wore a skirt, and a man was not understood to be a man because he wore his hair short. Universalism assumed universally that while differences existed, no one particular could ever fully define a person or an issue. Partition would follow universalism closely, and wherever it spied an opportunity to make a windfall, political, monetary, emotional, it would move in for the kill. Working on people's particularities, partition used those to the advantage of some and the disadvantage of others. Not content with making gains in universalism's wake, partition decided to ratchet up the implications of its logic and urged people and ideas and desires to declare independence from one another. Partition set itself up in opposition to universalism. What universalism traversed with indifference, partition pinned down with identity.
So in March of this year, I was invited to present my ongoing research at the presently postponed public series Sonic Continuum, curated by Sophia Lemis at Nottingham Contemporary. The talk was supposed to take place at the weekend programme titled Histories of Listening, so at the end of March. As I couldn't go to Nottingham, Sophia asked me to instead produce 2 audio pieces for the Contemporary Journal, which is their online iteration of Sonic Continuum during lockdown. And in isolation then, I went through old recordings and notes and sort of PhD writing and bits, and I started cobbling together something that could or would reflect the questions I was facing in my research, such as how to listen to history when evidence has been destroyed, how to listen to somebody who's faced systemic trauma, and how to interrogate colonial terms such as riot and communalism in the context of South Asia, in the making of event and time, how to understand historical silence through listening. So Partition Listening 1, which was only put up a couple of days ago, was the first is the first iteration of this mini-series. And it's a sort of audio paper, audio essay, collage, I don't know. But it sort of works as a counter-archive of testimony as well as a vaguely academic paper. So in the sense that if you go to the website, if you're interested, there's a verbatim transcript of everything that's said in the piece, but there's also references and footnotes, and it's clear that I'm making an argument in a vague academic way. So the piece, which runs at about 27 minutes, includes my recently deceased grandfather's voice, the voice of my friend at a shrine in Karachi, which was the site of a very violent and very invisibilized partition massacre in 1948, BBC programme from 1977 on India, as well as the voice of researcher Madhavi Menon, who positions partition and universalism as characters in a fable. And this sort of the structuring of this audio piece was really, I bookended it with Madhavi's own words, read by her, and it was very nice of her to sort of do it for me last minute. But she recorded herself. We've never met before, but I was really struck by the way that she theorizes partition as an opposite to sort of universalism, and queers this theory as well. But anyway, it's a very interesting paper if you're into that kind of thing. Between all these different voices are different sounds as well, and the sound design and co-production was done by Manya Daffa, who worked closely with me on the explanation of ideas and the pacing of the narrative, etc. It's August 1947 and a fire is raging in Delhi. Much else is unfolding. Indian independence, the birth of Pakistan, partition. This fire isn't engulfing mosques or temples, nor does it affect village homes or commercial bazaars. It isn't the doing of mob rule, mob violence, communal riots, or Hindu-Muslim riots. Although these official terms likely littered the many pages now curling up in flames. The bonfire of documents is so big that smoke hangs over the city for days. Evidence of 200 years of colonial rule is burning.
Against the continuing background of Hindu and Muslim riots, the plan for dividing India was hammered out. Mountbatten realized that his power to control the events by force was running out, so he advanced the date of independence to August 1947.
That's it, I think. I guess the last thing I would want to say is I wasn't really expecting to have an artistic practice, and now I realised that audio pieces have become that, or at least it's become a practical component of my research. And I feel sort of quite grateful that this has happened in the context of my PhD, because now there is now a way for me to sort of share my research in sonic form, which makes sense in terms of my research questions, but also in terms of what it means to be listening, which will provide, I think, new ways of thinking about this really incredibly complex historical topic, and finding new forms in which to express and think about it. Thank you very much.
I'm Katherine. I'm one of the PhD students in CRiSAP. I studied fine art originally, and afterwards for a while I didn't necessarily identify as an artist, and at that time I did a lot of different types of care work. And then I came back to identifying as an artist, and in that space I do various things. I make exhibitions, often with installation and video. I make performances. I do some things that are more like setting up contexts where people can make connections between what they do and learn from each other. I like to do workshops. I write. I make some sound. I co-facilitate and co-host various kinds of space for being together in ways that are not particularly productive of outcomes, but are generative of relational collectivity and connectivity. And in the past, that has involved participating in various kinds of slow and long-running art groups with artists who are not inside the mainstream art system, like preschool children, homeless adults, and people living in the traumatizing structure of the asylum system. And more recently, that's involved working with a collective to run a self-funded space for queer community called Tender Centre in Rotterdam. And I edit other people's writing for a job as well, and I really enjoy working with people writing in English as an additional language, and I really enjoy with that thinking about how to hold on to the creativity that people bring to the language when they speak it as a learned language, and how to kind of keep some of those qualities while also thinking about how the reader experience. I'm very slow, and my practice works at quite a deep level, my practice works at a level of deep time, with various things processing and coming round again and again, even when things on the surface seem to be changing. And listening has been one of these core questions for a long time, and the material effects of differentials of power and privilege has been another. My PhD project is asking what kinds of listening practices might be feminist and decolonial, and also thinking about how what those practices are might differ in different contexts. I'm in my first year, and I'm currently quite swamped and unable to clearly explain where I'm at with that. So I've decided today to share with you some reflections on a work I made last year. But before I do that, I was going to propose that we start with a small private act of attending to our bodies. I was thinking to do this for a couple of reasons. The first one, obviously, is that we're indoors wherever we are, in different conditions, and whatever the differences in those conditions, there's an expectation on us to show up here online. I don't find online learning particularly easy, and I have huge respect for you all coping or not coping with this current form of university life. So attending to the body becomes even more necessary in a way, right? Like maybe even more than usual, although it's obviously usually immensely important too. I'm going to propose that we do a small face massage exercise, and in some ways this condition of being in this online space is in our favour, because it's probably easier to choose to do this or not do this without social pressure of being in the same physical space. And it's a Taoist face wash exercise that I learned in Pauline Oliveros' Deep Listening, a composer's sound practice book, which is this one. And I never studied sound arts or music, so I came across Pauline's work around the point that I finally really got that I was actually interested in listening. I think like a lot of people, up until that, there was a sort of point of realization where before I'd thought I was interested in sounding, and then it was like, oh no, that's actually not the part that I'm interested in. Her work is obviously really well known, so when I talk about her in a workshop or wherever now, I kind of really like to emphasize the politics in her practice. I like to emphasize that she was a woman composer, a lesbian composer, a feminist composer, a composer interested in how people without musical training could learn and teach music at a time when all of these things were even greater barriers perhaps than they are today. And of course there's loads of complexity that we could unpack from our perspective now, because obviously her work grew in its own historical context. So I mean, we could talk about cultural appropriation and lots of things like that, but for now I'm just going to stick with this quite basic point that her work came from a political and politicized subject position. And what I continue to find useful in it is her insistence that many different ways of knowing and experiencing are involved in practicing listening, and that practicing listening is a process that's ongoing and never-ending. So the face wash I will do, and you can follow or not as you prefer. You rub your hands to get them warm and get some blood moving, and then you rub some of that heat onto your face. And then the first thing is to take your index fingers and rub the sides of your nose 36 times. And then rub your brow with your alternating thumbs 36 times. So like 1, 2, 3, 4. Rest your thumb knuckles, these ones, on your cheekbones, and take your index finger knuckles and rub around the eye sockets 9 times. Brush your lips with the palms of your hands, alternating 36 times. So like 1, 2. And then pull your throat with alternating hands, and not too hard. And then flick the backs of your ears with this finger so that they kind of make a thump back, and do that 9 times. And then make a V, like between your index finger and middle finger, and rub the sides of your ears 36 times. And then make kind of cups with your hands and place them over your ears 9 times. And then put your fingers kind of in this part of your ear and then spin them out in a twist 3 times. And then click your teeth together 18 times. And then the last one is massage your gums with your tongue, like outside your teeth. And this stimulates the tongue to relax it kind of forces it to relax by working it hard from its roots. So sometimes you can feel a little bit of pain down here, but that means your tongue's relaxing. And go 9 times one way and 9 times the other way. And that's it. So now I'm gonna move on to the work, and I'm going to talk a bit today about a performance called Tongue Breaks Inhaling. And I'm going to start by playing you a clip of the intro section, and it's about 10 minutes long. And I'm doing this for 2 reasons. The first is because it contains some information around access within the introduction to the performance. And I think the second is that it loosely gives you a bit of a sense of where I am with how I'm thinking about listening in my research more generally. Okay, so we'll play the clip now.
This performance is called Tongue Breaks Inhaling. It has been made by Katherine MacBride, Anna Fry, Raluca Krauturo, Angelica Falkeling, and Clara Jusen-Borg. It's about an hour long. Feel free to move around during the performance. If you need to leave, use the door to the rear of the space. There are cushions and balloons near the front. There's an induction loop installed in the part of the room closer to the stage. Use the T setting. There will be projected captions for spoken words on the screen behind the stage. The best sightline for these is directly in front of the stage. The best sightline for lip reading is close to the wall on the right side of the stage. Instruments and microphones arranged around the floor of the stage. There are 5 performers who will move around during the performance. Anna will play record turntables and does electronic sounds on the computer. Clara sings and plays some percussion and textiles. Katherine plays some records on another turntable and does some singing and percussion. Raluca sings and plays percussion and a phone. Angelica plays a clarinet, breathes, sings and plays percussion. There are 6 parts to the performance. All are introduced by some spoken words. The lighting will be different in each part. A video will play during each section with abstract images and colours. There are some objects in the space made of hard ceramic, soft textile and crinkly materials. There are lots of cables on the floor, so don't come over the white line. Thank you to Collective Text, Ross Wilcock and E.J. Raymond.
There was an idea here of a fictional future. One that imagines a different kind of life. There was that time in Athens thinking about how 1 + 1 equals many things. And A + B does not equal C or D, or anything simple and straightforward. The thing that struck me was the relationship to time. How the rocks were present in modernity, making modernity itself be just a blip. A temporary reality, nothing more. But those rocks signified something else. They signified the beginning of modernity's love affair with itself, the foundations of white privilege, the recasts of statues white and uncoloured, denying the truth of their making time. Communities accommodating difference around places that are now separated, as Africa, Middle East, Europe. Communities of fascists situating their power in the past. A divine right to make whiteness out of black death, Jewish death, Roma death, sometimes a while ago Italian death, or Portuguese death, Irish death. A female politician being punched on live TV by a member of a fascist group, nuanced strategies to tackle domestic violence, pragmatic and magical approaches to crisis. Her dad, who can't afford his health insurance and self-medicates with the gym until the pain is too much. People with stuff and no money, people with no stuff and no money. International education, discrimination in the north, being paid less than minimum wage in London. I finally read Women on the Edge of Time in 2017. I knew about it from Amelia. Thank you, Amelia. You're not here, I don't think. In Marge Pierce's book, she writes of a future where things are decided communally, where the earth is a respected and loved and cared for host, where work is shared according to ability. Childcare is degendered and genetics are shared. Difference is valued and appreciated. Pleasure is had. Struggles continue. Empathy and awareness of the body's capacities are high. Colonial reparations have been paid. Resources are not expropriated. When people cannot get on, they're asked to talk until they find something, anything they have in common. A book of small details, a future interspersed with a 1970s present where structural inequality forces poverty, violence, involuntary fertility and psychiatric pathologization of resistance onto the character. In the end, to fight to make the future happen, she loses her sensitivities, has to cut off her pleasurable possibilities of travel into the future. Time is entangled, not linear. I can't write a fiction now because it isn't true. It would be dishonest. I'm not sure if a white European person can write visionary fiction, or if her attention is better allocated to addressing historical and present realities. Decolonization happens in stages. Critiquing the structures, imagining others, making change. And maybe I wanted to jump some. The last remaining rescue boat in the Mediterranean just had its flag removed. EU money is being spent on detention centres in Libya, where people are tortured. Pesticide-induced soil sterility is starving the bugs. But I did want to imagine a present with some different turns in the past. I only just realised the connection between the past and present, that a perfect tense signifies in grammar. Pasts have consequences. In relationships, trauma and joy and previous life manifests, across generations even. My body is impacted by your previous behaviours. Your body is impacted and constructed by my present and previous behaviours. I exist because you starved. I exist because they were killed. We exist temporarily in this mess. My bones made from cosmic material brought to Earth on a comet. My body either a form of carbon capture or carbon release, depending on burial or cremation, and what kind of coffin I might get. My body borrowed on borrowed time, owing to everyone and everything else. With you in particles, if not mass, having been breathed out. And what would it be to feel so vulnerable? And what would it be to feel so supported? And what would it be to feel me feeling you? And to be okay with the momentary understanding that comes in a glance, and the lifelong misunderstanding that comes in a culture. What kinds of sensitivity might be expected, might be appreciated, might be valued? What ways of knowing? So I wanted to talk about this work because it's where I feel that I worked most successfully as an artist to consider different forms of access within the process of conceptualizing and developing the work. So I feel like here I was thinking about access as something that shaped the work rather than a layer of mediation that was added on afterwards. With most things I do, documentation is never simple, and I'm not particularly good at it, so I think it's quite hard to give you a good sense of what it was like to be in the performance. I'm very, very slowly working on a video version that I hope will give some of the sensory qualities in a different way, and I've just completed a video version of the textual aspects of the work, which I'll share a link to. But what I really want to tell you about is the process of making it, to show how considering accessibility for me is actually like a really creative process. And I'm gonna just briefly kind of, I don't think I can do a whole talk about like access and accessibility and what it is, but I'm just gonna really briefly run through some notes, which is just to kind of cover that, just to explain that when I talk about access, I'm trying to think about that intersectionally, and I'll put a link here to a group called Sins Invalids, and they have a 10 Principles of Disability Justice post on their website, which is actually really useful. So access could be thought of as proximity to resources, and it could be thought of as entry, participation, and feeling welcome in a space. And the structures that we need to access are physical, but they're also societal. So access can be thought of involving disability, race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, class, or any other form of categorization that has happened to people and can cause barriers to them being able to people being able to feel this sense of belonging or welcome. It can be to do with like migration, what languages are spoken in a place, different experiences of different forms of queer identities, socioeconomic factors. So, and when I say disability, I think that could be like deaf and hard of hearing, it could be blindness or visual impairment, deaf-blind, it could be cognitive disability, issues with speech and language, like long-term mental health issues. It's obviously things to do with mobility and wheelchair access, but also things that are less visible, to do with forms of chronic illness, such as like weakened immunity, which is something actually that we're having to think, everyone is now starting to, or having to think about more at this point in time, which is not a bad thing. So I'm just gonna do a bit of narrative of what happened in making the performance. So basically, as soon as I knew there was going to be a performance, I got in touch with a workers' co-op called Collective Text that existed in Glasgow at that time, and the performance was going to be in Glasgow, and it was important to work with a local organisation. I've worked with two of its members, Alison Smith and Amelia Beatrix, before, but this as artists, but this was the first time I'd formally organised access consultation for a work. We had some early discussions where I shared some ideas with them, and they shared various resources and information about making performances accessible. Having these conversations before I'd really started to make anything was super helpful, and began to also inform the structure and form of the work. So for example, I decided to build it into sections that split the spoken text from the rest of the sound, as that was a more manageable way for me of being able to caption the performance and have good visibility on the face of the person speaking, while also having flexibility that performers could move around stage and change instruments during the non-spoken sound sections. Since Collective Text were run by people with disabilities and chronic illnesses, and I also have ongoing mental health issues, we did this on the kind of expanded timescale that disability justice activists might call CRIP time. I went off and spoke to Anna Fry, who was my collaborator on the sound, and Anna's an amazing sound maker, DJ, event organiser, musician based in Zurich, and who runs this really lovely record shop called Our Own Room Records. And I'll put links to these here too. So I spoke to Anna, and I was going to work with three performers, Raluca Krotoru, Angelika Valkeling, and Clara Yissenborg. And we met and talked together about what ways of working do and don't suit them, and what their limits of comfort would be, and also what their desires might be. So for example, Clara said she wouldn't be able to learn a lot of text in English because she's dyslexic, and Anna said she absolutely wouldn't want to sing, and Jelika said she was really enjoying playing her clarinet again and would love to integrate that into the performance. So it was like all just kind of thinking collectively about what we would be able to do together. I then visited Anna, and we had a few days of intensively sharing our ideas around the sound. I'd come up with the framework of sort of content that we were going to work into. And so we spent some days listening to lots of music, walking, talking, drawing diagrams, starting to kind of map out rough possible structures and combinations of sounds, energies, qualities, intensities, tools, equipment, records. And we made some sketches like these. And then we moved into like an online software that we don't have access to anymore, where we made kind of like digital versions of these sketches. I developed some online scores that were kind of textual, but more like this. So each movement had a character, a colour, certain qualities, certain instruments, certain sounds, certain video materials, certain bits of text. Anna gathered a lot of sound samples and records and got her friend to help her program her granulation software to make inputs sound a bit more like how we thought Lena Platanos's music feels, because Lena Platanos was one of the characters. And then I came to Glasgow and had a bunch of meetings with Collective Text and two people called EJ and Ross, who are both from the local disability arts community, and they were providing consultation specifically on how the performance access was for profoundly deaf experience and for visually impaired experience. And this kind of local expertise is really important. And finding ways to share access budgets with people who are actually disabled is important. Ross gave some amazing advice about lighting design and visual description, which meant that we decided to not do visual description throughout the whole piece, but instead to do it as an introduction that you heard to the space at the start. EJ gave really great advice about captioning and sightlines and things to think about with makeup and lighting for performers who are going to be for people lip reading. And she made a BSL advert for us, for sign language. And that's important to pause on that as well, because there's so much work to be done in terms of redressing the ableism of art spaces. And part of that work is about making spaces physically accessible as well as socially and emotionally accessible in terms of how people talk to you when you get there. But part of it is also about building up engagements with communities that haven't felt welcomed in art spaces before, and that's very long-term work that requires serious engagement. Then Anna and Raluca and Yelika and Clara came to Glasgow. We stayed in the house together. We had 3 days of rehearsal with all the kit that we had available to us, which was like a bunch of microphones, like a mixer, a DJ mixer, 4 record decks, like a whole bunch of stuff. And then and also some objects that I'd made. Using the structure, I developed a structure of these scores, which was basically that there are 6 movements to the performance, an intro, 4 character sections, and an outro. And using this structure, we developed the performance through improvisation, and the scores became more like this. And then we had a tech rehearsal to set up the equipment and make a cue list for the technician. We were working with the PA of the theatre plus floor standing speakers to provide extra vibration. And for each movement of the performance, different inputs were routed to different sets of speakers so that the spatial vibrational feel of the sound was different. We wanted to be able to control certain things from within the stage, but had a lot of contact mics attached to things. So we had to spend ages attuning to the edges of where feedback would emerge and things like that. On the second day of tech rehearsal, we had the access consultants, EJ and Ross, come back in to watch the rehearsals and give feedback on how accessibility features like captions or seating were functioning, and on how aspects of the performance that were about access but also about kind of certain qualities of feeling were working. So we talked a lot with them about the lighting, what vibrations were coming through the floor, kind of tactile, like the tactility of the space. And then we had half a day to refine the lighting and get transitions down before the performance. And I would say, as a side note, that I struggled to take good care of myself during this process. And I managed to do a lot of these things because I worked past an exhaustion point, which obviously isn't ideal, and that's something that I'm continually trying to unlearn. And obviously there's many aspects, I've only really looked at like some quite specific aspects of access within the performance space here. Like I haven't really touched on some of the wider intersectional categories that I talked about as coming under how I think about access, but I think I've been talking for long enough now, and maybe I'll just play you a clip of some of the sound so you get an idea of something of an idea of the feel of the space, and we can talk more in the questions.
Boom 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 cha 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 boom boom cha 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 boom boom cha 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 boom boom cha 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 boom cha 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 boom boom cha 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 boom boom cha 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 boom boom cha 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 boom boom cha 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 boom boom cha 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 boom boom cha 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 boom cha 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 boom 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 cha 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 boom 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 boom.
A rock, he stays. 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 A rock, he stays.
She and we are made of time, the geological time that records the actions of all the ancestors into the ice.